Okay, this PowerPoint is going to introduce you to clauses and especially different types of clauses and the important things that we need to think about as we go forward and start to really analyze our sentences so that we can make them correct. Okay, so what is a clause? A clause is just a group of words that has two things, a subject and a full verb. So a subject we know in English is going to be a noun phrase, possibly a pronoun, and that's going to be at the beginning of our clause. So our clause should start with the subject. That should be the first word or words of a clause. And then that should be followed by a full verb or a real verb. And as you know, the subject and the verb should agree with each other. And then you should also see some tense in your full verb. So that's what we're looking for. Okay, two kinds of clauses. There's independent and dependent. And so we'll get into the definitions of those. For independent clauses, these are groups of words or a subject and a verb plus some other stuff maybe that can stand alone as a complete thought. It does not need anything to make it a complete sentence. So here are a few examples that we've got here. He memorized a poem last night. So when I take a look at that, I can see my subject there is he, and then I can see my verb is memorized, and those two, subject and verb, agree with each other. And then I also can see some tense there in memorize. That's in past tense. And then the part that I need in order to complete my clause is the object of that verb. So memorized is a transitive verb. That means that it needs an object. I can't just say he memorized and stop there. I need to say what he memorized in order for it to make sense. So I'll say he memorized a poem, and that would be a complete clause. The last night is an adverb. That is just giving us some extra information about when it occurred. And so that actually can move around. So we could say last night he memorized a poem. He last night memorized a poem, and that's a little bit weird. Or he memorized last night a poem, and that's a little bit weird too, but possible to say. So looking at our next example, Mary will read her poem. I've got my subject there, which is Mary. And then my verb is will read. And so those agree with each other. And we also have some tense there, the future with the will. And so I've got two words here in my verb, and that's okay. That just means it's a verb phrase, but it's still a verb. And then it also has an object. So in this case, read can be intransitive or transitive. You can use it either way. But in this case, her poem is the object of what Mary read. So that is included in this clause. And then my last example is many people enjoy poetry. And so I've got my subject there, which is many people. And I need both words to be my subject. So if I can replace that subject with a pronoun, I would say they. I wouldn't say many they people or they people many. No, that doesn't make sense. The whole thing needs to be replaced by they. So that's how I can tell that many people is my full subject, my full noun clause there. And then that agrees with enjoy. And we're in the present tense there, so we can actually see that I've got a plural subject, many people, and so I need the plural version of the verb. If I just was going to use a singular subject, if I said, this person or a person, then I would have to change it to enjoys. So I could say he enjoys or she enjoys poetry. So that's how I know it agrees. And then, of course, I've got my object there of the verb poetry. So for dependent clauses, you can probably guess that they do not express a complete thought and they can't stand alone. So we've got a couple of examples here. Let me show you, actually 3 examples. Let me show you those because they're just exactly like the independent clauses, except you'll see that there's one thing that's different, and that's that they have this word on the beginning, and we'll get into what those are in just a second. So here are some dependent clauses. They all have subjects, they all have verbs. If they need an object, they've all got the object. These cannot be sentences by themselves. So if you try to write one of these as a sentence in your essay, like you put a capital B on because and then a period after last night and you just leave it at that, that is wrong. That is not correct. This cannot be a sentence by itself. It has to be connected to an independent clause. You've got to have at least one independent clause in your sentence. So this is not going to do it. Okay, so what makes one clause independent and another dependent? You can probably guess that it is this word on the beginning. So when I take he memorized a poem last night and I just add the word because to the beginning, it changes the clause from an independent clause to a dependent clause. So because he memorized a poem last night, that is not a complete thought. I need more information. Because what? What is the reason? You've got to tell me. You have to include that information or it's not complete. Same with when Mary will read her poem. When is it going to be? What is the time? You can't just say when Mary will read her poem and then end it there. You've got to include it in a sentence that has the information. And okay, let's see. Okay. So what is the thing that makes a clause dependent? And you can probably guess by looking at the examples that I just showed you that it is this word at the beginning. And those are called subordinating conjunctions. That is going to come up a lot. So you really need to know your subordinating conjunctions. And I've got a resource for you that has a list of them. There's about 35 to 40 in English. You probably don't need to memorize all of them, but just like the main ones, the ones that you use, the ones that you understand, that's going to be like because, if, some of those time words like when, after, before, those kind of things. And so we can take our independent clause, and if we want to make it into a dependent clause, we just plop one of those words on the beginning. And so if we want to do that, then what we need to do for our sentence is we need to include an independent clause. So every sentence in English has to have at least one independent clause. It can have more than one, but it doesn't need more than one. It needs exactly one. It can have a dependent clause or multiple dependent clauses, but it's optional, doesn't need to be there. But if we do want to give information for a dependent clause, we've got to tack it on to an independent clause somehow. So this is one option of doing it this way, putting the dependent clause first and then followed by an independent clause. And if we take a look there, we can see Mike will receive extra credit is independent. I've got my subject there, Mike. Will receive is my verb. And then extra credit is the object of that verb. And there's no subordinating conjunction on there. It's just Mike will receive extra credit. So that is independent. That can stand alone. And so if I want to include the information because he memorized a poem with that subordinating conjunction on the beginning, then I need to attach it. This is another way to do that. So all I did here was just switch the order of the clauses. So now instead of starting with the dependent clause and then ending with the independent clause, like the first example, I just switched them. So now the independent clause, Mike will receive extra credit, is first, and because he memorized a poem is second. And so you can see the big change there is the comma. in the first example, we've got to have that comma. If the dependent clause comes first, we have to have it. If the dependent clause comes second, we do not use it. And that's just one example of the different punctuation patterns that we're going to be looking at in a couple of weeks, and why it's so important to understand the sentence structure and clause structure and the different kinds of clauses and different kinds of conjunctions, because you wouldn't be able to know that, that we need a comma in the first example, but we can't have a comma in the second example if you don't have that. Okay, some few other things that you need to be aware of, and that is a different kind of conjunction called coordinating conjunctions. So these are the fanboys. You probably have heard of fanboys before. If not, it's just the words for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. Those are very special words in English. They have a real specific function. And when we start to look at the punctuation patterns, you can see that that is even more the case. We've got to know what these are and what they do so we can look at our sentences and punctuate them correctly. But for now, just remember that these are really probably your most common conjunctions, right? And, but, so, maybe even or. Those are probably the most common ones that you use normally. And so they work in one specific way. And then we can compare those to subordinating conjunctions that work in a different way. And we need different punctuation rules and clause structure rules for each of them. So I'm going to ask you to memorize these coordinating conjunctions. Just know the fanboys when you see them. And then when you see a conjunction and you're not sure if it's coordinating or subordinating, you'll be able to tell, because if you can rule out coordinating, then it has to be subordinating. Okay, and then another item that I want you to be aware of, these are not actually conjunctions, but they get confused for conjunctions because they kind of have a conjunctive type meaning. So these are usually called conjunctive adverbs, transitional signals, transitional adverbs sometimes. They have different names. The point is that they are not conjunctions, they're adverbs. They function like adverbs. So the word however, it has a similar meaning to but. But when we're looking at our sentences and we're trying to write our correctly structured sentences, and we're trying to figure out where our different clauses can go, what order they can go in, and in particular where our punctuation needs to be and what type of punctuation, we have to treat them different. They may have a similar meaning, but their function is different. So we just have to be aware of these. And so when we start to look at the punctuation patterns in a couple of weeks, this is going to become even more clear, but I do want you to be aware of it for now. Okay, that brings us to the end of this PowerPoint. Thank you very much.